He was well this morning. How can a man be dying by supper?
This sickness doesn't ask permission. By tonight, we will know which way it goes.
The year is 1348, and across Europe, you are about to learn just how dangerous it has become to simply get sick. Medieval people actually faced many of the same diseases we still face today. So the real difference was never the sickness itself. It was everything medicine still didn't know how to do about it. No vaccines, antibiotics, no real understanding of germs at all. Just rest, the strength of your own body, and a considerable amount of luck. And some of these diseases killed quickly, some killed slowly, and one or two barely killed anyone at all, and they just made survival itself feel like a punishment. Today, we're looking at 7 of them, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why a common cold could become a death sentence, while a few of the worst medieval cures were arguably more dangerous than the diseases themselves. So let's ask the question properly. Did getting sick in the Middle Ages actually mean certain death? Or is that reputation worse than the reality ever was? 7 diseases, 7 very different ways to suffer, and one honest answer waiting for you at the end of all of them. Let's start with the first of our 7. In 1485, right after the Battle of Bosworth Field, a strange new sickness appeared in England, unlike anything doctors had ever documented. Victims developed a raging fever and drenching sweats, so sudden and so severe that some collapsed within hours of feeling perfectly fine that same morning. What made this disease so terrifying was who it actually killed, since healthy young adults in the prime of their lives died from it far more often than children or the elderly. Henry VIII was reportedly terrified of it, and historical accounts describe him fleeing his own palace and changing residences constantly whenever an outbreak was reported nearby. Physicians at the time believed the sweat had to be allowed to run its course, so the standard advice was to wrap the patient tightly in blankets beside a roaring fire and simply wait. But in practice, that advice frequently made things worse instead of better, since overheating an already fevered body is now understood to be exactly the wrong approach.
He was laughing at supper, sir. Now he can't lift his own head from the pillow.
The sweating sickness returned in waves roughly every decade for over 60 years, and to this day, nobody has definitively identified exactly what disease it actually was. After the sweat came the scars, because smallpox worked its way through medieval Europe in violent waves, covering victims head to toe in painful, fluid-filled pustules within days of infection. Survivors were left permanently marked for life. Deep-pitted scarring across the face and body that never fully faded, no matter how many years passed. And beyond the scars, a significant number of survivors were left partially or completely blind as well, since the infection frequently scarred the cornea beyond any repair. Medieval physicians had genuinely nothing that worked against it. No inoculation, no proven remedy, just isolation, prayer, and whatever comfort could be offered while the disease simply ran its course. Entire households were sometimes shunned by their own neighbours for weeks after a single case appeared, since nobody understood exactly how the disease actually spread.
Keep your children from that door until the marks stop spreading. That is the only medicine any of us actually has.
Late in the medieval period, a disease later known as syphilis spread rapidly among soldiers and sailors, earning a different insulting nickname in nearly every country it reached. The Italians called it the French disease, the French called it the Neapolitan disease, and nobody involved wanted to admit whose army actually first. The standard treatment doctors reached for was mercury, a substance now known to be seriously toxic in exactly the doses it was actually prescribed. Patients treated with mercury often developed a second set of symptoms entirely, and a popular saying at the time summed up the grim math perfectly.
A night with Venus and a lifetime with Mercury. That has always been the honest price of this particular pleasure.
Across much of Mediterranean Europe, Fresh, unpasteurized goat's milk and cheese were dietary staples, and they carried a hidden danger nobody understood at the time. A bacterial infection, now called brucellosis, passed easily from infected goats into the people who drank their milk, causing recurring fevers that came and went for months at a time. Victims experienced exhausting waves of fever, joint pain, and drenching night sweats that could last for weeks, then seem to disappear, then return again just as badly. Medieval physicians had no real way to connect the illness back to something as ordinary as the family's own dairy supply, so the disease simply persisted for generations unexplained. It would take until the 19th century for anyone to finally connect the fevers to the goats themselves, and by then the disease had already quietly outlasted the entire medieval period.
It comes and goes with some families, always has. Rest him, and it will pass again, same as always.
Now for a disease that did as much damage to a person's place in society as it ever did to their body. Because leprosy was one of the most socially devastating diseases of the entire medieval period. The disease damaged nerves slowly enough that many victims lost sensation in their hands and feet entirely, before they even fully understood what was happening to them. In some regions, a leper was made to kneel through an actual funeral-style ceremony, declared dead to the community while their own body was still very much alive. From that point forward, lepers were required by law in many towns to carry a bell or a wooden clapper, warning everyone else to keep their distance long before they got close. But leper colonies actually became some of the most organised medical communities of the entire medieval period, since they were forced to care for each other when nobody else would.
You will find more mercy inside these walls than you ever found beyond them. That much, at least, is worth something.
Not every disease on this list picked its victims at random, because gout earned the nickname the disease of kings for a very direct reason. It was closely tied to the rich diet of red meat, wine, and excess that only nobility could actually afford. Victims experienced sudden, excruciating pain in their joints, most commonly striking the big toe with a suddenness that could wake a grown man screaming in the middle of the night. Physicians correctly suspected a connection to diet centuries before anyone understood uric acid, and their advice to simply eat and drink less was actually reasonably close to correct. That advice was rarely followed, since giving up rich food and wine was exactly the kind of sacrifice most medieval nobility had absolutely no interest in making.
Less wine, less meat, my lord, or your own table will keep putting you back in this chair every winter.
Which brings us to our last, and, in raw numbers, deadliest disease of all. Dysentery, known at the time as the Bloody Flux, killed more medieval soldiers on campaign than enemy weapons ever did. Contaminated water and spoiled food spread the infection rapidly through crowded army camps, where basic sanitation simply didn't exist in any meaningful form. King John of England, one of the most powerful men in the country, died from this exact disease while on campaign in the year 1216. Entire military campaigns collapsed, not from battlefield losses, but from dysentery alone, since an army that cannot march or fight has already lost the war either way. Treatments amounted to little more than rest, boiled water, and simple broths, since nobody yet understood that the contaminated water itself was the actual source of the problem.
We've lost more men to the flux this week than we lost in the entire last battle, my lord.
So did getting sick in the Middle Ages mean certain death? Not always, but across all 7 of these diseases, it meant gambling with far worse odds than any of us would ever accept from modern medicine today. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe, because every single cure modern medicine takes for granted today was paid for by centuries of people who simply had no other choice but to endure.